Hello, I'm Eva, and I would like to welcome you to my knitting podcast, The Charm of It. Hello, I'm Eva, and I would like to welcome you to my podcast, The Charm of It, in which I unpack my knitting basket and talk about other knitting related topics. My co host number one, my puppy, is in my lap already. Her name is Thistle, and my other pet, my cat, might appear. She's sleeping in the gray chair behind me right now, so she might hear me talking and decide to come over. If you are a returning viewer, thank you for coming back. I really appreciate that you want to find out what I've been up to. And if you're a new viewer, thanks for giving me a try. I tend to focus primarily on knitting. I don't do a lot of personal segments, so if you're mainly interested in knitting, then hopefully you'll find something to talk about. Please feel free to join the Ravelry group, which is The Charm of It. I really enjoy talking about knitting stuff over there with all of you guys. I am also on Instagram as The Charm of It, and I have a blog called, I'm sure you can guess by now, The Charm of It, in which I talk about books and photography and personal stuff, as well as doing the show notes for all of my knitting podcasts. So, there's one administrative note. I've decided when I first started recording these videos, I planned to only record them every other week. And then they were running so long that I decided to start recording every week. But I just can't maintain this schedule. I'm starting to feel a little bit burnt out. It's quite a bit of work. So I want to keep this fun and keep it interesting, and I'm going to go back to recording once a fortnight. So after this, expect to see a new video every other Monday. And with that, I suppose we will jump into finished objects. I did get quite a few questions, and since I don't plan to record for another 2 weeks, I thought that rather than talk about the topic, I would just go ahead and answer all 3 of those questions in the topic segment so that you guys don't have to wait too long for an answer. So there won't be a specific theme this week. It'll be more random knitting stuff. So I have 2 finished objects. The first is my Red is Blood beret, which I have blocked but not woven the ends in on. And this is from a knitting pattern in the book Vintage Modern Knits. See, there's the ends. Called the Yvette Rossitude hat or beret. And it features the Estonian folk knitting traditional technique of rossitude, which is a way of doing color work where instead of knitting the color work yarn, you're basically weaving it as you knit. And there's moth's tail. And this was my first time trying out this technique. As you can see, the pattern has it going pretty much up to the crown. And I thought I had a great time doing it. It was really fun, and it was pretty easy to get the hang of, and I love the effect. I love how it looks a little bit like tapestries. I adore tapestries. I had a great time visiting the cloisters for the first time last April with so many hanging tapestries, and so I really love this technique, and I definitely want to use it more in the future. I made this hat out of Manos de Uruguay. I can't remember which line of it is. Fino, maybe? No. Anyway, it'll be in the project notes. It's a sport DK weight single ply yarn that is 70% merino and 30% silk. And it's kettle dyed. Sorry, I'm drinking water today because I'm recording a little bit later, and after mid to late afternoon, I switched to only drinking water for the rest of the day so that I stay hydrated and don't stay awake at night because my body is very sensitive to sugar and caffeine. So, okay, so back. Sorry. Okay, so the red is Bing Cherry. Can you tell I'm really tired today? You might have to put up with more rambling than usual. The gray is Coal, and the greenish variegated that's also got pinks in it that aren't showing up on the camera but they're there in real life is Briar. And finally there's a little bit of brown, And this is the Fiber Company's Road to China Light, which is a sport weight yarn that I used to knit a very shallow shawl out of. And it is in, oh, can't remember the name right now. It's a brown colorway though. Smoky Quartz. So one thing that I did not like about the pattern is that rather than tell you exactly how many yards you would need of the contrast yarns, it just said you would need a skein of each. And actually the pattern called for Road to China Light, which is a luxury yarn. So I can't imagine buying 3 skeins of it just to use. So I made sure that I measured my skeins before and after I knit with them, and that information is on my project page if you want a better idea of yardage. My throat is really dry today. I apologize for any issues like that. But that complaint aside, and the body of the hat took a little bit less than 1 skein of this, and they're 50-gram skeins. 50 grams, 150 yards, so it really didn't take that much yardage at all. So that complaint aside, I really liked this pattern. I think it turned out really well. Here it is on, so it's a bit slouchy, but not too slouchy, and I just really love it. So I've blocked it, and after I blocked it, I noticed that the pattern on the crown, the gray pattern, I left it a little loose on purpose because I wasn't sure how much the fabric would stretch in blocking, and so I had to go back and tighten that up, which was a little bit fiddly, but it took maybe 5 minutes, so that's not too much fiddliness. I do still have to weave in all the ends, but I think it's worth it. I really love this technique, and I'll be trying it again. I'm surprised there aren't more patterns on Ravelry that use it. So, yeah, I think that's all I wanted to say about that. Oh, I will say that the yarn that the pattern calls for is sport weight, and this is more of a DK. So I did have to substitute, and all I did for that was I looked at, their gauge was, I believe, 26 inches to 4 inches or something. And so then I looked at how many stitches you're supposed to cast on and divided that so I knew how many inches they were aiming for the body of the hat. And then I just changed that to my gauge. So I ended up casting on the hat. The pattern has you knitting the hat once you get to the crown decreases in 8 wedges, and I cast on enough to just do 6 wedges for the crown decreases. So my pattern covers a little more proportionally of the hat than the pattern originally envisioned, but I think it worked out well. As you can see, I haven't woven in that end yet. Oh, it'll tighten right up. And yeah. So other than that, I think I knit it to pattern, and even though I was getting a larger gauge for stitches, I was getting the same row gauge, so I didn't have to worry about the hat ending up gigantic behind me. My other finished object I don't have to show you because I already dropped it off with the friend who's going to mail it out, but it is a Grumposaurus stuffed animal, and this is for my friend Chris. His father is going through, I believe, his 3rd round of chemotherapy, and he's feeling a little disheartened. And so Chris has started a project to try to keep his spirits up, and he's appealing for help from both strangers as well as friends. And you can go to his website, creatingalight.blogspot.com. I'll link it in the show notes for more information. But he's basically asking people to send postcards or letters or little gifts of encouragement. And so I thought that having a little mascot might be helpful. And then I was looking through all the patterns on Ravelry, and the Grumposaurus one made me laugh. So I sent it to Chris, and he said his dad would appreciate it too. And so I went ahead and knit that up. I'm going to insert photos here since I can't show it to you. I knit it pretty much as the pattern suggested. The only change I made was the pattern has you do the spines as like a picot thing and then seam it, but I decided to just pull out a crochet hook, and I did my spine ridge thing just by doing chains, and I'll detail that in the project notes in case you would like to do that too. I think it was much simpler. And I used Barocco Ultra Alpaca, which is a worsted weight 50% alpaca, 50% wool. For the body, that's the blue. It's in the Azure mix because I had it caked up. And then for the spine and then the embroidery for the face, I just used some of my leftover Knit Picks Reverie, which is a brushed baby alpaca yarn in the black colorway because I had it and I thought that the black and blue would look fun together. So those are my 2 finished objects for the week. I'm going to have to start a new clip because of my camera, and when we get back, I will start answering questions. Let's get started with answering questions. I'm not going in the order that they were asked just because I'm going to answer all of them. So I'm just going in the order of, for me, simplest to trickiest to talk about. So first of all, Shirley, whose username is Sage Hill, asked how to unravel and reuse yarn. And in her question, she was under the impression that I have unraveled thrift store sweaters and knit with that reclaimed yarn. I have not done that. I tried that once and it didn't go well. The yarn basically kept breaking when I was trying to unravel the sweater, and it was incredibly frustrating, and so I decided not to do that. I would like to try that again someday, but yeah, I think it's a little difficult. I never seem to find the color that I want in the fiber that I want in a slightly thicker yarn weight because, you know, most retail sweaters are super fine gauge, which I think can be tricky to unravel. Anyway, but luckily Shirley wants to reuse the yarn from a hand knit project that she made, and I do have experience with that, so I should still be able to help with it. So there have been a few projects that I have either unraveled mid-project and reused the yarn, or in one case, after I had worn a hat all winter, I ended up unraveling it and repurposing it. So I found it pretty simple. All I did was, first, of course, I found the end, and I unwove the end, and since it was a hat, you know, I pulled it out from those final stitches that you pull the end through. And then I just started unraveling the yarn, and I had my computer chair nearby, so I could just wrap the yarn around the back of the computer chair so that it wouldn't tangle. Of course, if you have a Nitty Knotty, that would work, or a Swift. Basically, anything, or like someone's arms, very patient someone, anything that you can use just to make sure that your yarn isn't getting snarled while you're undoing it. So as you're unraveling, the yarn's going to be kinky just because it's been knit for so long. So once you've unraveled all of it, you'll have this big kind of loop, and then you want to take some scrap yarn and tie the loop in 4 places, not super tight but not super loose either, and that's just to secure it so that it can't tangle on itself. So you do that, you know, at 4 opposite, so you're doing it at quarters. If it was a clog, you do it at 12 o'clock, 3 o'clock, 6 o'clock, and 9 o'clock. So once it's tied, then you're going to want to soak it the same way that you would block a knit garment. So fill a sink or a bucket or a bowl or whatever with lukewarm water and a little bit of wool wash. I like the no rinse wool wash just because it's easier, and I'm a fan of easy. So I think I use the Euclin just because that's what my local yarn store sold in Texas, and I found one bottle lasts a really long time. I use the unscented because I'm very sensitive to smells, but it comes in lots of scents. So you do some wool wash, or you can use regular soap if you don't mind rinsing later, but if you're at all worried about felting, I think a no rinse soap is the easiest option. So then once you've got your soapy lukewarm water, you just put the skein, or the hank I guess, in that, and you kind of gently push it down and gently kind of squeeze it a little just to make sure that water has completely soaked in it. You don't want to agitate it a lot, and if you need to add more water, make sure it's the same temperature, because if like sudden temperature changes and agitation are both things that can lead to felting, so just to be on the cautious side. And then just let it soak. I usually let it soak for at least an hour, sometimes longer if I forget about something. And then come back, and I use my sink. So I drain my sink, and then I kind of squish as much of the water out as I can. You don't want to wring it. You just want to be gentle with it. And then wrap it up in a towel and kind of step on the towel to get even more water out. And at that point, it should be damp instead of soaking wet. And so once it's damp, I either lay it to dry or hang it up from one of the scrap yarns. And once it's dry, it should be straight again, and you are ready to wind it into a ball and reknit with it. So yes, that has been my procedure, and I find that it works really well. Better than just unraveling the yarn and knitting with it kinked, which can do kind of sloppy things to your stitches and throw off your gauge. So that is one question. And then Inez, whose Ravelry name is Inez versus the Wool, asked, how do I find free patterns on Ravelry? And she mentioned that she tends to be overwhelmed by the options when she's searching. So basically, I always use advanced search. I never even start with the basic search. And usually I'm searching, I have some yarn in my stash that I want to knit with, and I know a general idea of what I want to make with it. Like when I wanted to knit up the Cherry Manos del Uruguay skein, I knew I wanted to make a hat. So I start with the category. Oh, sorry about throwing off the focus there. Once I'm in advanced search on Ravelry, I start with the category. So in this case, I narrowed it down to hats. And then in my case, I knew I wanted it to be a beret, so I narrowed it down further to a beret. And then, of course, I click the free option so that I'm only looking at free patterns. And then, depending on how much I feel like adapting a pattern, I'll select yarn weight. So this is a DK yarn, so I think I selected worsted, DK, and sport because I find it fairly easy to modify one way up or down, especially for something like a hat. And then, so that's when I'm just randomly browsing, and then I'll start going through my options. Ravelry defaults to sorting by the most popular patterns, and that's just usually what I stick with. And if I know I want to do color work or cables, you can select all those in fabric characteristics or design attributes. So the advanced search option in Ravelry is really powerful. And then while I'm browsing, anything that catches my eye, I open into a tab. And I look at it, and if it's a free pattern, even if I decide it's not right for whatever I'm searching for at the moment, I add it to my library because I liked it. So that way, when I'm searching in the future, instead of doing an advanced search of everything, I can just search what's already in my library, and then everything that's coming up are things that I already like. So that would be the other thing that I do. And that's what I do more of now because I've done so many of just searches through all of Ravelry, so I've added a whole bunch of free patterns to my library. So my library is quite a large resource at this point. And the other thing that I do with my Ravelry library is whenever I check a book out from my actual public library, a knitting book that has patterns, I add it to my Ravelry library. That way when I'm searching, those patterns come up and I know that those are more free options for me because I have access to that book in my library. I hope that that makes sense. Because I live on a fairly small income and I tend to be frugal, whenever I'm searching for a pattern, I always search my library or free patterns on Ravelry first, and if nothing seems to be quite right, then I'll start looking at paid for patterns, just because that's the frugal side of me. And there's so many great knitting books and free patterns available on Ravelry. And a lot of times I'll look at a pattern and decide to modify it. So I'll talk a little bit more about that on my current works in progress because there's one in that. But yeah, so basically when I'm randomly browsing, anything that catches my eye and is free, I add to my library. And then later, when I don't have as much time to search, I only search inside my library. And that brings up things that are catered to my interests and tastes. When I'm searching paid for patterns and I really like something, I add it to my favorites. So then I can easily go into my favorite section. If I want to, say, knit a shawl and I'm willing to pay for that pattern, then I can just go and look at all the favorited patterns that I've had. So that's not exactly part of Inez's question, but that's another way that I use Ravelry, just because that's what works for me. But I'm sure that there are a lot of ways. I just love how powerful the website is. So the other thing that I'll do if I know that I want to knit with certain yarn, but I'm not sure what pattern, is I'll go to the yarn page and then I'll look at what projects have been knit with it, especially projects, let's say hats again. I'll narrow it down to the hat category and kind of get an idea of what the yarn looks like in hats, what kinds of hats it seems best suited for, that kind of thing. So I hope that that helps, and I will be back to answer the final question when I start the next clip. The final question is from Claire, whose Ravelry name is Tipsy Turtle, and she's asking about yarn substitutions. And in her question post, she included a link to a great website that I had not heard of before, but I have since looked at, and it's a wonderful resource, so I want to make sure to share it here. It's called yarnsub.com, yarnsub.com, and I'll include that link in the project notes. And yes, it's basically you can type in a yarn and it'll tell you different yarns that are similar and how they're similar and how they're different and where you can go buy that yarn. So it's a very wonderful resource. So in my case, I often start with the yarn rather than the pattern. So I guess I approach yarn substitution from the other direction. So I'm starting with a yarn, and thanks to reading the Knitter's Book of Yarn and the Knitter's Book of Wool and a few online resources, I have a general idea for what it's going to do. For instance, when I was knitting with Juniper Moon Farms Harriet, which is 100% baby alpaca, I knew that it was going to have a lot of drape and not very much elasticity at all. So a hat would not have been the best option because it would end up just swooping off my head. So I really like to knit with yarns that have a bit of silk in them, which I think just adds a beautiful dimension of color as well as some nice drape. And the thing other than fiber content that I look at is how much twist there is. And then, so based on that, I'll kind of decide what kinds of patterns I want to do. For instance, if something is a high twist pattern, then I know it's going to have a lot of really sharp stitch definition. So maybe that's when I want to do, I don't know, a texture stitch or something like that. And if something has a bunch of silk in it, then I know that it's going to drape really nicely, so maybe I want to do some lace to take advantage of that. And so that's my usual approach. If I want to knit a specific pattern, then I will look at the yarn it calls for. And a lot of times I try to find something that's fairly similar. For instance, when I made my Castles in the Air shawl with the mustard seed pattern, that called for a yarn that also had a significant mohair content in it. And that was enough for me to feel comfortable. I don't know why my throat is so dry today. But I would not say that I'm an expert on yarn substitution by any means, and so I think that that website has a lot more information. I basically know the kinds of things that I like out of yarn, and I try to knit patterns accordingly, if that makes sense. I'll try to talk about my works in progress, why I decided to knit certain things with certain yarn. For me, the main thing that this comes up with is socks, because, you know, I have a whole bunch of sock patterns. I was checking my library, my Ravelry library. I have 700 sock patterns because there's so many free ones, and then there's so many great sock pattern books that my library system owns. And so basically, whenever I want to knit a pair of socks, I have a whole bunch of patterns to choose from. But depending on the characteristics of the yarn, I can kind of narrow it down a little. Like if I'm going to use Quince & Company's Finch, then that's a slightly plumper yarn, and so I want to make sure that I'm knitting a sock that I can easily adjust to somewhere between 56 and 60 stitches, but it is also really tightly twisted, so I know that I can do any kind of texture or cables, and there's going to be a lot of great stitch definition. Whereas if I'm using Ultra Alpaca Fine, it's a thinner sock yarn, so I can look at patterns that call for more stitches, but I also need to be aware that it's not going to have the same stitch definition, it's not as tightly twisted, and it tends to be a bit splitty. and then just, I don't know, different yarns seem to call for different types of patterns. So I guess I tend to start with the yarn, not the pattern. So I'm probably not the best to ask with yarn substitution. What I do if I am looking at a pattern is if I don't feel like doing a lot of modifications, I'm mainly looking at a yarn that works up at the gauge, but also fabric I like. My second sweater, my swan sweater, I knit it and I got gauge with the yarn, but that yarn must have been a little stiffer than, or a little bigger than the designer yarn, and so even though I got gauge, that fabric is stiffer than I would ideally like in a sweater, so that really taught me a lesson there. But yeah, I'm sorry that I don't have more to offer as far as specifics go. That's pretty much what I do. And yeah, I think that once you start knitting with the same yarns more than once, you tend to get more of a feel for what it does. So that's another reason why I like using the same companies, is because then I'm not so surprised by the yarn. I already have an idea about gauge and how it's going to behave and that kind of thing. And yeah, so hopefully that answered your question a bit, and I'm going to start a new clip and talk about my works in progress. Time to talk about works in progress. First up is my next sweater. I want to do a self-designed Aran style cardigan. I think I mentioned this on the last episode, but I can't quite remember. And so far, all I have is a giant swatch that I've been playing with over the past week, as you can tell. So many cables. Okay, so as you can see, it's quite long. So obviously I was not just swatching for gauge here. I was swatching to try out different cables. And first of all, this is Elsa wool, which is 100% Cormo, and it's the sport weight woolen spun in the natural white color. I love this yarn. I'm really excited to get to the finished sweater. So I knew in my head some of the things that I wanted out of this cardigan. I knew that I wanted it to have a peplum. I knew that I really like honeycomb stitch, and I really like braided cables, and I really like Aran sweaters that have a panel on the back of like interlocking cables. But that still left a lot kind of up in the air. And so I started swatching with not only cables, but also different options for background stitches, because I also wanted to have a shawl collar. And what I found was a little bit surprising. So for instance, I did 2 honeycombs. I did a little tiny honeycomb, a 1x1 pattern. And do you see how the fabric is a little holey? And this is after blocking. And I liked how it looked, but I didn't necessarily like that texture. So then I tried bigger honeycombs. And I like that the fabric is a little more solid, but it's also quite thick and stiff. You can see this is the same amount of stitches. This is garter stitch, and this is the honeycomb, so it draws in a lot. So I had been thinking that I was going to do honeycomb all up the sides of the cardigan, but now I just feel that that would be a little too bulky. So, and that's for me, and the reason why I have such a long swatch is because I want to find that out before I'm knitting the sweater, right? So this is very much me playing with the yarn and getting to know it and playing with my ideas, and it's surprising how much ideas can change or not change and be, I don't know, I have a really good time with it. So I didn't rush the process. Basically, I knit about that much, and then I stopped and blocked it. So that took a day, and then I knit some more and stopped and blocked it, and that took a day, and then I knit this, and I started playing with decreases because I've decided to do the honeycomb as part of the peplum, so I need to see how decreases behave in the honeycomb, and blocked it again. And so that's why it took a week to get here, but now I think I have a really good idea of what I want to do, and I've started sorting out my numbers, so I'll probably finish sorting them out today and maybe cast on for the first part of the sweater tomorrow, so that's pretty exciting. And in that case, I'm not using a pattern, so I can't really talk about how I found patterns or yarn substitution or anything for that one. But next up is the one that I thought I would talk about. So these, oh, I should mention, so the cardigan, I was trying to think of what to name it. And it seems like a lot of the women associated names for sea kind of stuff are like the fisherman's wife, widow, captain's daughter, that kind of thing. And while I feel that those names have resonance, I also don't really like that they kind of cast the woman only in relation to the men in her life. So then I was thinking about the Selkie story, which I love. If you guys haven't seen the movie The Secret of Roan Island, you should watch it. It's very good. And of course, in the traditional Selkie story, the seals transform into women, and if a man can steal her seal skin, then she has to be his wife and she can't go back to the ocean. And so I started thinking about what if instead of him stealing her seal skin, he came to her and he offered her a kind of replacement skin for when she was human. And what if that was a custom done Aran sweater? So that is how I ended up with the name A Second Selkie Skin. I might have said a second skin for a Selkie. I can't really remember right now. I'm really tired, I'm sorry. And so, yeah, so that was the inspiration behind the name. And I kind of like that reimagining of the story to make it more a thing of partnership and caring. There's an excellent reimagining of Selkie myths in a novel by Margot Lanigan called The Brides of Rollrock Island, which I also highly recommend. And her exploration is very much an exploration of patriarchy as well, which is just fabulous. Which is a long way of saying that's how my cardigan got its name. And back to my next project. Oh. Uh-oh. Sorry, it fell towards the bottom. Okay, so these are my winter morn gloves. I mentioned on the last episode that rather than casting on for a new pair of socks, I should probably start some new gloves. So that's what I did, and the first one, I finished the body. Woo, sorry, that's a mess, except for the thumbs. Here we go. And this is out of Quince & Company Turn, which is their fingering weight yarn, and it's 70% wool, 30% silk. And the blue is looking a bit more bright than it is in real life. It's a little dustier in real life, but I will show you. Here it is on. So clearly these are going to be full gloves. And the beads are just cream beads that I got when I made my mom's pair of Owly socks a very long time ago. Okay, so with this pattern, the pattern is called Queen Lucy's Mitts, and it's a free pattern, and obviously it's written as fingerless mitts, not full gloves. And so I came across this pattern when I was browsing, and so I added it to my library, and then later when I was trying to decide, I have 2 skeins of this, and I wanted to do a hat and glove set, and I wanted them to look kind of refined and elegant. And so I was looking through the mitt patterns that I'd added to my library because it's very easy to adapt fingerless mitts into gloves. And I came across this pattern, and I just thought that it would be excellent for that purpose. This yarn has a nice tight twist, so I knew that it would show the twisted stitch as well, and that the cream beads would play well with the kind of dressy silk content. So that's how I decided on that, and I named them my Winter Morn Mitts because the shades of blue remind me of a clear winter's morning, and then, oh, sorry, focus. The white beads remind me of snow on the ground, usually. And so the first one is done except for the thumb. I always do the thumbs last. I'm not sure why. I guess that way, in case I run out of yarn, the thumb wouldn't show as much. And I am almost done with the thumb gusset on the second one. And I have I've been taking notes on the modifications I made to the pattern in case you're curious. But the pattern itself is excellently written. I highly recommend it. She gives both general instructions for people who are familiar with mitts, so you can just go off and do the thumb gusset and that kind of stuff, but then she also gives line-by-line directions, and it's charted in an excellent chart, and I just think it's such a clever design. So I would highly recommend this pattern, and I can't wait for my finished pair of gloves. I'm going to put some cream beads in the hat too to make it look more of a matching set. And then I'm still working on my sister's birthday mitts. Her birthday is February 6th, so I have already told her that she's going to have a slightly belated gift because I finished the first one, but this is how far I am on the second. Just a tiny bit of ribbing. But here's the first one, and I'm calling these post-impressionist mitts. Once again, I haven't done the thumb yet. This is going to be an afterthought thumb, but I put in waste yarn, so I don't need to just cut. And that gray is the waste yarn. And I've blocked this. I wanted to make sure the colors didn't run before I knit the second one. And I think it looks much better after blocking, thank goodness. And this is actually a mitten pattern based on Van Gogh's Starry Nights that I've adapted into elbow length mitts at my sister's request. Oh, I'll take off my ring. I'm really pleased with how this is turning out, but it's one of those patterns that I can only do so much on it because I have to be constantly looking at the chart and then trying to tension the lace weight yarn is all just a bit difficult on my neck and shoulders, so that's why it's not the fastest moving project. But I really love how this fabric has turned out with the lace weight yarn. It makes me really want to try doing a lace weight sweater because I think I would really love that fabric. And yeah, so I'm looking forward to having the completed pair done. The second one has a different pattern on the back since it's inspired by the painting. And hopefully that will work out fairly quickly. And I got pretty lucky, so the original chart ends about here. And obviously I needed more length, so I just went back and repeated a certain amount of rows. I'll include the specifics in my project notes. This is a paid for pattern. And it ended up, I think it looks like it flows well. It doesn't look like I just tacked it on. So I did get lucky there. I will say that this is a $6 pattern, and basically you're paying $6 for the chart. There's not a bunch of information on how to make the mittens. There isn't any information at all on the decreases. There's a little bit about the thumb, but the charts are clearly very beautiful. So it's up to you. And she even has the thumb charted in spiral too. So it's up to you if that's worth $6 or not. I have one final work in progress to share. After I finished the Grumposaurus, I realized that all I had left were the gloves and the mitts, which are both lovely, but they're both in finer yarns, and they're both a little bit fiddly. You know, you have to think about the pattern. So what I really wanted was some mindless knitting, and with my arthritis, I like to alternate between different needle and yarn weights to help my hands. So I knew I wanted it to be something in worsted weight yarn. And I've been wearing my cowl that I knit myself a few months ago so much this winter that I decided that another big poofy cowl would be fun. And I happen to have a lot of Barocco Ultra Alpaca in various colors in my stash. And this blue I'd originally bought to make my sister a blanket, but my sister lives in South Texas. So instead I'm going to make her a sweater. And I'm going to use, so I have about 1,000 yards of this. It's the blueberry mix. It's really pretty. I love the heathers that Barocco does in their Ultra Alpaca line. It's a lot darker than it's showing up. It looks more like a navy, and then when you look close, you see teal and purple running through it as well. Anyway, so I have about 1,000 yards of this, so I thought I would make a cowl, and then I might make a matching vest to play with it. And so I was going through cowl patterns, And I came across a free one on Ravelry that was a brioche cowl pattern. And so many of you in the resolutions thread for the giveaway mentioned that one of your resolutions is to learn brioche knitting, which made me very curious about it. And Maria from the Stitched in Sweden podcast, which I love. If you haven't watched that yet, you should go start watching her. She's wonderful. But she did a sweater that had a brioche cowl, and it just looked super cuddly. So between all of you guys and that, I decided to go ahead and give this a try. And I am in love with this. I cast this on Friday, and then this was the only knitting that I did yesterday because I spent the day with friends. So I needed something super simple. And you do the same thing for every single row, and it's really easy, even for someone like me who usually finds knit two together is a little fussy. I find SSKs easier. It must just be the way I knit. But I have no problem doing all of these knit two togethers, and the resulting fabric is so light and fluffy. I am really in love with this. So as I mentioned, this is Ultra Alpaca, which is a worsted yarn. I'm knitting it on size 9s, but I'm purposely tensioning my yarn quite loosely because I want this to be a loose, light, floofy cowl. I don't want it to be thick or, anything like that. So basically the pattern is super simple. It has you just knit this to the length you want, like a scarf, and then graft the ends together. The pattern doesn't give you any information on grafting, but before I cast on a pattern, I always go through the projects. You can look at projects and you can narrow down to ones that people have marked as helpful. So I do that. And so I found links to video tutorials about how to do a cast on so that you can graft it later. So this is a provisional cast on. And I'll include links to all this on my project page if you're interested. I will say that the video for the provisional cast on, I ended up having to do it twice because there was a part that I was not paying enough attention to, but that's okay. Because even since you're knitting it at such a loose gauge, this is 46 stitches, and as you can see, it's quite wide. So it wasn't that big a deal to rip it out and redo it. And then I used a video from Webs to learn how to do the brioche. And yeah, I'm not sure if there are different techniques or what, but this one is super, super easy. I would say it's easier than Cables by far. And by easy, I mean less fiddly. Let me say it that way. It's less fiddly than Cables. It's less fiddly than most lace projects. You don't have to do any counting or anything. And as you can see, if my camera wants to focus, okay, the stitches kind of naturally group together. So that's what I meant about the knit two togethers being really easy, because since the yarn over and the stitch, they're already hanging out together. So I was working on this while I was talking. I didn't have to look at it. I even worked on it in the dark for a little bit. So yeah, I'm having a lot of fun with that, and clearly it's knitting up very quickly, so it's going to make another nice smooshy cowl. I haven't decided yet exactly how long I'm going to make it. My alpaca cowl that I wear so much, I can loop it 3 times to get it super snug, or twice to get it more poofy, stylish. And I think this one I might do so that just looped on its own it looks the stylish method, and then when I loop it twice it's nice and snug. And if I do that, then before I graft it, I'll put a twist in it, because I think that if you're going to wear it without any loops at all, the twist kind of adds a bit of presence. But I don't have to make any of those decisions for a little while yet, which is nice. So those are all of my works in progress and everything like that. So now up we have the outfit segments and a little bit of bookish stuff. I'll start with the bookish thing because it will be shorter. So this week, one of the books I read was Hild by Nicola Griffith, which is an incredible historical fiction novel. It's set in 7th century England, and Griffith must have done so much research because she brings it to life before your eyes. This isn't the type of book for you if you're mainly interested in plots, if you're that, there are so many different kinds of readers. This book is much more focused on the interior life of the main character, and then bringing to life her daily world of 7th century England. So if you enjoy social history and that kind of thing, or if you enjoy those historical farm shows that the BBC does, then I think you'll really, really like this one. So in 7th century England, wool and, well, all over Europe really, a major part of women's work was creating cloth. And so this comes up a lot in the book, and so I'm just sharing one of the many, many passages with you guys. So, today she would attend her mother in the main weaving hut. Post-shearing, when hands were soft and smooth with sheep grease, was when the most intricate patterns using the most delicate yarns were set up on the looms. She was the only young girl to work on the main loom, the only one tall enough, the only one with the pattern-making mind, her mother said. So that gives you a little taste of the kind of daily life details that she includes in the book. And yes, it's obviously there's no knitting because it's 7th century, but there's a bunch of weaving and shearing sheep, spinning yarn, distaffs and spindles are mentioned, and all of that. And it's portrayed in a way that shows that not only were women doing this on a domestic level, but it was also very important economically, and so it was very important politically. It's a really excellent book. And if you're interested in nonfiction, I mentioned this on a previous podcast, but there's an excellent popular archaeology nonfiction book called Women's Work, The First 10,000 Years by Elizabeth Wayland Barber, and you will learn so much about this kind of thing, and it's fascinating. I'll include both of those in the show notes. I'm going to restart a clip, and we will talk about outfits and knitwear in the wild this week. I managed to photograph 3 outfits for the Knitwear in the Wild segment. I'm glad that you guys are finding this useful. And for the first one, I need to apologize. It's not in focus. I accidentally switched my camera to manual focus and didn't realize it, so I was using my remote. So I thought I was focusing when I was taking the photos, and I didn't have time to check them. And so when I uploaded them to my computer, I realized that they were blurry. But hopefully you can get the gist. I wore my pink swan sweater, which, as I mentioned, is probably my least favorite sweater, but I still really like it. And it's a little itchy to wear next to bare skin, so instead of layering a long-sleeve t-shirt under it, I layered a long-sleeved cream blouse with a collar so that it was kind of part of the look. And I wore it with corduroys because I love corduroys, and I was doing kind of casual activities that day, so the corduroys seemed like a good choice. I ended up going to the library, and I got to the front, and I went to check out my books, and the librarian looked at me for like 30 seconds, and then she goes, "Someone made you that sweater, didn't they?" I was like, "Yes, I made the sweater." And she was like, "Oh, okay." And it turns out she was a knitter too, and she's making a vest right now that involves an I-cord bind-off, which she hasn't done. And that swan sweater has an I-cord bordering both parts of the yoke. So she was asking about I-cord details and that kind of stuff. So that was really fun. And yeah, she liked my sweater. So we talked about how fabulous Ravelry was and all that. Next up is an outfit where I was wearing knit accessories. I wore that teal collar that I crocheted for, I think, last month. I wore it for the first time. I really enjoy dressing in tonal colors, and so that's why I combined the teal with the lighter robin's egg blue. I wasn't sure if the teal color would push it over the top as far as matchy-matchy went, but this was a day that I was at home. So those are the kinds of days when I feel free to take a little bit of a risk with my clothes and see if I feel comfortable or not in them before I go out in public. And then I also wore my leg warmers because I wore my snow boots on this day, and my snow boots only come up to my mid-calf. So with a knee-length skirt, obviously, it's nice to stay warm. I'm really impressed with how practical the leg warmers are. And then someone in the last episode, I think, asked if I wear knit socks. Yes, I pretty much wear a pair of hand knit socks every day. They're not always in the outfit photo, so I made sure to be far enough away that you can see my socks. Today I was wearing navy blue socks to kind of pick up the navy in the skirt. And the skirt is a vintage wool skirt that I thrifted, so it's super warm. And then my final outfit is yesterday I mentioned I spent the day with friends. And these are the friends where we do our own little Christmas celebration once I'm back from Christmas in Texas. And this year, for one reason or another, we couldn't get together for most of January, and then we finally got together yesterday. So that's why I decided to wear a Christmassy outfit. And it wasn't that cold out, so I decided I could wear a cotton skirt and cotton t-shirt that are both thrifted, and then just put the big poofy cowl over top to stay warm. And I like the combination of brown, white, and red. I don't know, it seems very Christmassy to me. I wore my leg warmers again. I was having pain issues with my shins, and the leg warmers felt a little cozy. It might have just been, mental, but I'll take any kind of pain relief I can get. And the red socks that I knit for Christmas Eve, and so I thought I would wear them again, even though they're a little bit darker than the skirt, but I think it was fine. And I apologize for the wet hair in this photo. It was the only time I had to take the photo, so it was wet hair or, no photo at all. I forgot to take photographs of my accessory and coat combinations this week. This was a bit of a stressful week for me, but I will try to get back into the habit of doing that since you guys seem to find that useful as well. And yes, so there you have it. That is pretty much everything I wanted to talk about, and probably more. Really quickly, I thought I would review a knitting book again, since I haven't done that for a couple weeks. Oh, you okay, Miss? So, since I wanted to knit a fisherman's sweater, I went ahead and got Aran Knitting by Alice Starmore out from the library. I really enjoy Alice Starmore's books. They tend to be very thorough, and they tend to focus a lot on theory as well as practice and encourage you to kind of do your own thing as a knitter. And this book was no exception. There are patterns in this book, but there's also this whole section on basically how cables are made. And so it gives you ideas for how to modify cable patterns or just design your own cables, as well as including some beautiful examples that she has designed. So there are one or two in the book that I plan to use for my sweater, and then just watching her swatches kind of grow and she discusses things like that I found very useful. So I would recommend this book. This is the second edition, and the preface is a little funny. It also includes some history and preface, and I will say that no one's ever going to accuse Alice Starmore of false modesty. She knows that she is a very intelligent, very gifted knitwear designer, and she's not afraid to sing her own praise. So I will just add that observation to if you're going to read her books. It doesn't bother me one way or the other. And then the patterns in this are just beautiful. I wouldn't knit any of them unchanged because I prefer less ease than she has designed, but I certainly can see adapting them. And I just knit my first Alice Starmore sweater, my last one, my pink one, my thistledown sweater, and I had such a good time doing it. So I definitely plan on knitting more of her designs. And I would love to have this book on my own shelves one day. So if you're looking for a very thorough book about history and techniques and inspiration for Aran sweaters, and she also includes Celtic cables, I think is what she calls them, which are the locking kinds of cables like this. Then this book is well worth a look. And yeah, so I would recommend that book as well. So I will see you all in 2 weeks. Until then, I look forward to catching up with you in the Ravelry group and on Instagram and seeing what projects you're working on. And as always, feel free to ask me any questions or just get in touch and leave me feedback. I really enjoy chatting with all of you guys. As I mentioned, I think every episode, I started this podcast so that I could have a kind of virtual knitting circle, and it has succeeded beyond my wildest dreams. So I look forward to catching up with you, and hopefully the new schedule works out for you guys as well as me. Bye!